As punk rock exploded in the year 1977, there were a few punk bands that didn't go along with the concept of writing songs that were only 3 or 4 chords. They also didn't like the fact that all punk songs were usually fast and under 3 minutes with a basic verse-chorus structure. These punk bands that didn't follow the song rules were called post-punk. John Savage coined the term in November of 1977. One of the strongest bridges between post-punk and punk rock is the DIY spirit. Both of these scenes thrived in basements, community centers, and other non-traditional DIY spaces. While post-punk rejected the simplicity of punk rock, they fully embraced the punk belief that you didn't need a major label, a massive budget, or permission from the industry to create culture. Post-punk marks a chronological shift of music that came after the initial punk explosion,
and an intellectual evolution of music that went beyond the simple rules of punk rock.
Both the US and the UK would call these bands new wave or punk until the early 80s when the UK started to use the word post-punk more historically. Lots of these bands didn't refer to themselves as post-punk, they saw themselves as just another rock band that maybe have derived from punk and is more experimental. The term post-punk was mostly used in the UK, which is why you don't see too many US bands that are called post-punk. The US would still refer to some of the post-punk bands as new wave, and the UK would call some of the US bands post-punk, such as Pere Ubu and Suicide. The term new wave was basically an umbrella term that covered anything that came out of the punk scene in the late 70s. In the early 80s, the term new wave started to become its own genre, which included bands that were using synthesizers as the main instrument and bands that were more pop and dance oriented.
Even though the new wave genre in the 80s sounded and looked nothing like punk rock, many of the bands had origins playing with punk bands or somewhat connected to the punk scene, like the New Romantic movement that started at Billy's, named after Billy Idol. Here are some of the well-known new wave bands.
All of these new wave bands were getting radio play and videos on MTV, while punk rock still stayed underground without being introduced to the mainstream.
On August 1st, 1981, the MTV channel first aired, and at first it played mostly new wave and pop music. The very first music video that it played was Video Killed the Radio Star by a new wave band called the Buggles. The new wave artists mostly already had video content before MTV, so it was easier for them to choose their songs.
Are we not mints? We are Devo. Are we not mints? We Dio.
MTV is the main reason why new wave was such a popular genre in the early 80s.
While MTV was playing a lot of the new wave bands, it still didn't play most of the post-punk bands. Only a couple like The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. But most of the post-punk bands were seen as too dark or abrasive to be played on MTV. The difference between post-punk and new wave was that post-punk was darker and experimental, while new wave was brighter and radio-friendly. Here are a few examples of the post-punk bands to compare them to the new wave bands previously mentioned.
Smash, 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 smash to the radio. They must have come to a shared understanding. That's the well shame. That's the well rule, and I must escape. I need an order. I need an order. Place to end, fled to end. In a while, in a hard rain.
A lot of post-punk bands were band members that were already in punk bands, or they used to be a punk band and just decided to change their sound. Joy Division is an example of a post-punk band that used to be closer to punk rock.
They walked in line, they walked in line, they walked in line, they walked in line.
Their original band name was called Warsaw, and they had more of a punk rock sound, but in early 1978, they changed their name to Joy Division and became known as a post-punk band because of their bass lines, atmospheric sound, and experimental riffs.
After the Sex Pistols broke up in early 1978, Johnny Rotten formed a new band a couple months later and ended up calling it Public Image Limited. He also no longer wanted to be called Johnny Rotten. Now he wanted to go back to his original name, Johnny Lydon. Public Image Limited had some of Johnny Lydon's songs that he already wrote, and they also wrote a few new ones, and they released their album in December of 1978. Johnny Lydon wanted this new band to be completely different from what the Sex Pistols were, and he wanted it to be more DIY without a manager. They still ended up having managers, but they weren't as controlling in the way that Malcolm McLaren was. Lydon wanted this new band to be an anti-rock band, which is why it ended up being one of the pioneering post-punk bands.
And we get paid for this.
Susie and the Banshees was another post-punk band. When they started off in 1976, their songs would be part of the rest of the first wave of punk rock. Once they had John McKay join the band on lead guitar in 1977, their sound started to move away from traditional punk rock sound. This is when they became more experimental and atmospheric, which made them a post-punk band. A lot of these post-punk bands have a dark aesthetic. They play longer and slower songs, and often in minor keys. The drums often sound mechanical, and many of the post-punk songs revolve around the bass riff because the lead guitar in post-punk is usually playing textural riffs like a layer of sound instead of playing the main riff. Out of this subgenre called post-punk came another subgenre called goth. Not all post-punk bands are goth, but a few of them are. Before the term was used in music, people would use the term to describe something that is dark, romantic, morbid, or haunted. Around 1979, the term was being used to describe some of the post-punk bands because their style fit these descriptions.
While post-punk lyrics were often intellectual, political, and socially conscious, Gothic songs were often toward romanticism, morbidity, and the supernatural. Gothic vocals were often more dramatic with deep baritones.
There isn't a single time when the term was first coined for post-punk bands. But many people say the first post-punk band to be called goth was Bauhaus in 1979 when they released their first single. Bauhaus formed in 1978, and instead of calling themselves goth, they referred to themselves as dark glam. The term goth came afterward in the music press. Their influences were performers like Brian Eno and David Bowie. They also were influenced by reggae and dub music. Bauhaus was different from the other post-punk bands because their songs had long gaps in between the vocal lines and instruments. They also used silence to create tension, which made the songs sound more haunted. Some other early popular goth bands were UK Decay and Southern Death Cult. Most of the goth bands were influenced by Bauhaus because they showed that they could slow down riffs and be more atmospheric. UK Decay was one of the bands that started off as a regular punk band in 1978 through 1979. But by 1980, they became more of a post-punk and goth band. Southern Death Cult, on the other hand, were basically already a goth band as soon as they formed in 1981, even though they played a lot of shows with punk bands. We will survive! We brought Christianity to your land! One of the most popular goth bands is The Cure. During their 1979 album, they were a post-punk band. But during their 1980 album, they became more darker and a goth band. They had some promo videos that could be music videos, and they were more TV friendly than the other post-punk bands, which is part of the reason why they were being played on MTV. Some early punk bands dressed kinda dark before the goth genre was around, like the singer of The Damned, Dave Vanian. But the rest of the band members from The Damned were still dressing punk with safety pins and ripped clothing. However, on The Damned's Black album in 1980, they shift toward more of a post-punk and goth band. One of the early places for the UK goth bands was a venue called the Batcave. This venue was created by Ollie Wisdom from the post-punk band Specimen. He wanted it to be a club where people could express themselves through dark fashion and music without any strict gatekeepers. It was located in Soho, London, and what made it different from the punk venues was its focus on theatrical atmosphere and dark glam.
Not all of the post-punk bands were dark like the goth bands. During the first wave of punk, an early UK female punk band called the Slits were loud and chaotic. But when they released their single in 1979, it became a landmark for post-punk because it was more experimental with influences of dub and reggae. Experimental is the main term that describes post-punk. After seeing the Sex Pistols perform in July of 1976, the band The Fall formed shortly after. Their lineup was always changing, but still managed to be experimental throughout the whole time. Even though they were originally influenced by the punk movement, they saw it as too limited and soon to be cliche, so they became more of an avant-garde band, which made them one of the first post-punk bands. 'Cause I'm in a trance. A foundational post-punk album is the self-titled album by the band Killing Joke in 1980. It influenced industrial bands with mechanical rhythm and tribal drums. Three very significant albums in post-punk were the very first three albums of the band Wire. Their first album, Pink Flag, is often seen as the very first post-punk album. The second album, Chairs Missing, introduced synthesizers. And the third one was even more experimental. This album was called 154, which was named after how many shows they played so far. These albums were made in 1977, 1978, and 1979. Another popular post-punk band is Gang of Four. Their music is very danceable. They ended up influencing many well-known bands such as R.E.M. and Red Hot Chili Peppers. Their debut album was called Entertainment, and it came out in 1979. Sometimes I'm thinking that I love you, but I know it's only lust. Your kiss so sweet. These were all just some of the more popular and well-known post-punk bands in the UK, but there were plenty more post-punk bands in the UK throughout the post-punk era, which is generally seen as 1978 through 1984. Let's slip away. Let's slip away. When it comes to post-punk, The Clash are arguably the most famous band, even though they weren't like the other new wave bands who got famous from MTV. Instead, they reached fame from their impact, political relevance, and international tours. Even though their music wasn't dark like the goth bands and many of the other post-punk bands, they are still seen as a post-punk band because of how they changed their sound to be more experimental instead of strictly punk on their London Calling album in 1979. While post-punk was a genre big in the UK, the country still had new wave bands forming around the same time that wouldn't be seen as post-punk. The term overlaps both ways, but there is still a distinction between them if you wanted to really classify a band into a genre. The Police weren't really a punk band, but they were in the punk scene when they formed in 1977 and when they released their first single.
By 1979, they were mainstream and many punks were skeptical, saying that they were a new wave pop rock band because of their polished sound and hooks. They ended up becoming more famous than The Clash because their songs were made for pretty much anyone to sing along to.
Roxanne, you don't have to put on the red light.
Some of the bands that came out of the punk scene would start being more melodic and hook-driven, like the band Generation X. This was Billy Idol's band. At first they were a punk band that played many shows with all the other first-wave punk bands, but around 1979 they became more polished and it led them becoming closer to new wave. By 1981 the band broke up because Billy Idol wanted a commercial success and a bigger production. This is why he started his solo career and became well-known mainstream new wave act.
Now stay tuned. Start again.
Billy Idol's friend, Stephen Strange, who was a punk show promoter in London, was getting tired of the punk scene around 1978 because it was starting to fade and the look was becoming more of a uniform with safety pins and ripped clothes. Strange was a big fan of David Bowie, Roxy Music, electronic music, and he was a big fan of glam, but punk rejected glam. He believed electronic dance music was the future, so he opened up a club in 1978 called Billy's, named after Billy Idol. This club was only open on Tuesday night and there was a strict door policy. You couldn't come in if you were dressed like the punks would dress. Instead, you had to be theatrical and dress dramatically. This is where a new movement started to form called the New Romantic Movement. Billy's was starting to get very packed, so they moved the event to another club called The Blitz in January of 1979. This is where the movement really started to take off. The term New Romantic wasn't really used until late 1979 in the music press. The Blitz didn't really have many shows there, but they did have some. Instead, this club was more of a place for fashion and music people to network. The first New Romantic band to form out of the scene was called Visage. This was Steve Strange's band. The New Romantic bands are considered new wave instead of post-punk because they are more polished and hook-driven. They also weren't about being confrontational or experimental. Many famous new wave bands came out of the New Romantic scene. Most of these New Romantic bands wanted to be famous, unlike the punk or post-punk bands, and if you were a regular at the Blitz, then the media would most likely notice you. Many new wave bands played shows with punk bands in their early years, and some did not. Regardless of who they played shows with, they all ended up in the new wave umbrella term instead of punk or post-punk for one reason or another. Meanwhile, across the pond in the late 70s, there were still more post-punk bands forming. Even though the US wasn't really using the term at the time, they still had bands that would fit into this genre. Some of the US post-punk bands tended to be more art-driven and avant-garde, while the UK post-punk bands tended to be more darker and ideological. The UK post-punk bands often emphasized bass lines more so than the US post-punk bands. Because the term wasn't really being used for the US bands, they would often be referred to as art punk, avant-punk, and of course, new wave. One major US post-punk band is considered as Pere Ubu. Their first album, Modern Dance, sounds closer to post-punk than it does to regular punk rock. However, they could also be called art punk. Art punk is a genre that still sounds like punk rock, but just playing it a lot differently. But post-punk evolved from punk and sounds like it's barely even punk rock anymore. Many bands that are post-punk are also considered as art punk, but there are very few bands who could only be seen as art punk, like the band Styrenes, who played in the same Cleveland scene as Pere Ubu. The term post-punk also represents an era, which is from 1978 to 1984. It starts in the year of 1978 because that's the year that most of those punk rockers wanted to move past the three-chord rule. And by 1984, the post-punk label started to fade because the bands were either becoming massive pop stars or they evolved into entirely new genres. One of the most defining punk bands in the US is often seen as the band Mission of Burma. They were from Boston, Massachusetts, and they played many shows at the Rathskeller along with many other post-punk bands and punk bands.
They're often considered as a gold standard of post-punk because they went beyond punk's basic rules, introducing technical complexity without losing its raw power. Even though the Rathskeller was the epicenter for punk bands, it still had other bands play there as well. The band The Cars was from Boston, and even though they weren't a punk band, they played many shows at the Rat in their early years alongside many punk bands. During this time, they would still be called New Wave because the term was an umbrella term and they were considered a power pop or art rock band. But by the time they went mainstream, they became known as one of the biggest new wave bands of the 80s. Even though the Cars were playing shows with punk bands in their early days, they still ended up being one of the new wave bands instead of a post-punk band for a few different reasons, such as more futuristic and radio-friendly. However, the lines often get blurred when it comes to labeling a band as either new wave or post-punk, such as this next band from the New York scene.
The Talking Heads are one of the New York bands that are often viewed as either post-punk or new wave. Their first album in 1977, they usually get labeled as art punk or new wave because the term post-punk wasn't around back then, and basically anything in the punk scene was called new wave at that time.
But from 1978 to 1980,
that is when they made 3 albums, and this period is often seen as their post-punk era because they worked with Brian Eno during this time. Brian stopped working with them after their 1980 album, and from there they were now a commercial success with a pop aesthetic that defined the decade.
And from 1983 to 1986,
this is when they started to be seen more as a new wave band.
Television often gets grouped in with post-punk, but they weren't really a post-punk band because they were around before the term. They were more on the artistic side of punk instead of playing fast, so they were another band that could also be seen as art punk. But when it comes to post-punk, they could be called a proto-post-punk band because they influenced many of the early post-punk bands. Patti Smith Group is another band that could be seen as art punk. If Television and Patti Smith came out in 1978 and sounded the same way that they did, it would most likely be called post-punk. Even though Blondie was already leaning toward a pop sound since they began, their third album is what made them a well-known new wave act. They were known in the UK during their first 2 albums, but were still underground in the US until they released their third album, Parallel Lines, with the hit song Heart of Glass. While much of the punk scene was against overproduced rock music, long guitar solos, corporate rock bands, and hippies, there were still some bands forming in New York that felt like punk rock wasn't radical enough. These bands were called no wave. These bands weren't trying to form a new popular genre. They just made music intentionally trying to sound alien and abrasive. Their goal was to deconstruct the idea of a rock band. Most of these musicians were avant-garde artists or filmmakers, and music was just an extension of their art. No wave fits underneath the post-punk umbrella term. However, what makes it different is that post-punk still wanted to make songs that used melodies and structures, while no wave was anti-music. Lydia Lunch, the singer of Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, is often credited with coining the term when she was asked in an interview if she was new wave, and she responded by saying she was no wave. However, the no wave bands reject the label, and no one is really sure where the term comes from. One of the main reasons no wave formed in New York was because of the downtown New York art scene. It wasn't a big scene though. The new wave genre only had a handful of bands in New York, and it lasted only for a couple years, from 1978 to 1981. In 1978, Brian Eno was in New York to produce the Talking Heads' second album. While in New York, he was introduced to Anya Phillips, the manager of the Contortions. She invited him to a 5-day music festival at Artist Space Gallery. During this time at the festival, he saw about 10 different no-wave acts there. These no-wave bands impressed him to the point to where he felt they needed to document them before they inevitably break up. He decided to make a compilation album with some of the bands, so he selected 4 of the bands for the recording: DNA, Mars, The Contortions, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. The album was called No New York, and it had 16 tracks with 4 songs from each band. Out of the no wave genre, many musicians were influenced by it and made their own bands similar to no wave. Bands like Swans and Sonic Youth formed out of the no wave scene. However, instead of being about destruction and anti-everything, they took the abrasive sound and turned it into a long-term music project. Sonic Youth formed in 1981. And Swans formed in 1982. Even though Swans and Sonic Youth wrote non-musical noise songs, they still were talented musicians, while many of the no-wave acts didn't even know how to play instruments. No-wave bands had a lot of quick songs that were just bursts of chaos, while Sonic Youth and Swans had a lot of long compositions. They bought vans and wanted to tour, while many of the first wave bands were basically art gallery performances. Because the term no wave was for a small group of bands in New York in the late 70s, critics ended up giving them the term noise rock, which was used before them in the 70s, but they ended up being the defining sound for the term. After Sonic Youth and Swans were called noise rock, other bands that sounded similar to them across the country were now also called noise rock. Some of the noise rock bands are seen as post-punk, like Sonic Youth, Swans, and Big Black. However, a lot of other noise rock bands are not seen as post-punk. Noise rock bands were all around the country in different cities. Another pioneering noise rock band was one on the West Coast with a band called Flipper. Two of the band members were in the band Negative Trend, and when that band broke up, they formed Flipper. Flipper is also considered as a post-punk band because they go beyond the limits of punk rock. Instead of playing fast songs with a couple of chords, they play slow, sludgy songs that prioritize the wall of noise.
I saw you shine.
The West Coast have many other punk rock bands that could be considered as post-punk because they go beyond the limits of punk rock.
I like the feel of canvas, I like to touch my paint. I'm painting burning buildings, I'm painting burning buildings.
Another subgenre that formed in California is called death rock. Death rock formed out of hardcore punk and punk rock in the early 80s in LA. This genre is basically the US version of gothic rock. One main difference between death rock and gothic rock is that death rock bands were closer to punk rock because they played energetic and chaotic. While the goth scene was more melodramatic and atmospheric. While it still isn't like a lot of other post-punk genres because it's rooted in hardcore punk instead of poetic sadness, death rock is basically the missing link between punk and goth music. Early death rock is considered as post-punk because it goes beyond punk rock with eerie keyboards, gothic aesthetics, and stage theatrics.
Another early post-punk scene was the small college town of Athens, Georgia. The scene began in February 1977 for a Valentine's house party, which was at the B-52's first show. Many of the bands were students at UGA's School of Art. It was a combination of art school and house parties that created the music scene. The post-punk scene was a lot of bands that were danceable art rock. Many of the bands were students at UGA's School of Art.
The Athens post-punk scene was different from the other post-punk scenes because it was more about dancing, being goofy, and having fun, while the other post-punk scenes were more political, darker, and a lot of them, like the no-wave bands, didn't smile. Athens was isolated from all the other scenes, and it proved that a world-class scene could happen anywhere, even in a small town in the South. The B-52s were labeled as both post-punk and new wave, but their album in 1983 is when they were seen more as a new wave band, because they replaced their organic party band sound with electronic beats and a more polished synthetic production style. B-52's self-titled album was released in 1979. They were taking multiple trips to New York to perform at the popular venues there. After their song Rock Lobster became a hit song, they moved to New York in 1980. This is around the same time when another Athens band formed called REM. REM's first 3 albums are considered as post-punk because of their DIY ethos and their approach to music as a conceptual art project. They were one of the first college rock bands, which is a term for bands that were played on local student-run radio stations. REM put Athens on the map by proving that bands didn't have to move to New York or LA to be important.
It's called Murmur. It's by a group of gentlemen from Athens, Georgia, called REM, and we're happy to have them making their national television debut with us tonight. Please welcome REM.
This inspired other college towns in the US to do the same, and it became the college rock movement. Another genre that REM is called is jangle pop. They basically use the same jangle sound from the 60s bands like the Beatles or the Byrds, except with a post-punk attitude. Another popular jangle pop band that is considered as post-punk is the band The Smiths from England, and they formed in 1982. The Smiths are a post-punk band because they take the energy of punk rock and use it to create something ambitious and introspective. The bass lines carry a lot of the songs, and the lyrics are often about ordinary misery of life. Lots of non-traditional guitar work with shimmering or jangly riffs instead of rock cliches and power chords.
As soon as the UK post-punk scene started, punk and post-punk began to spread into mainland Europe. Many of the post-punk bands in mainland Europe were formed because they were influenced by the UK punk and post-punk scene. In 1977, Sounds magazine used the term cold wave to refer to some of the post-punk bands, but France and Belgium adapted this term, and many of the mainland Europe post-punk bands were now called cold wave because of their colder and mechanical sound. The term cold wave also made sense because of the political climate of the Cold War.
Θυμίζουν τους ήχους μιας άστοχης βολής. Caem será que hoje eu lembro, já não sei. Просто хочешь ты знать, где и что происходит.
Outside of Europe and the US, there are also many other bands that fall underneath the post-punk umbrella.
Walk in Africa, walk with barefoot man. The water's cool, sun shines through your hair. Please, 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 please leave me.
Some will try to rule the universe by force, but I prefer to stay close to nature.
Run away, I will follow.
There are many other post-punk bands around the world, but these are just a few examples to get an understanding of what post-punk is. To recap, post-punk is a term that was coined in 1977 in the UK to describe bands that carry the punk rock spirit while going beyond punk rock's limits. Some of the punk and post-punk bands that lean more into pop and radio-friendly sound with catchy choruses for mainstream audience, these bands were labeled as new wave. Not all of the new wave bands came out of a punk scene. New bands that sounded post-punk in the mid-80s were now labeled as different genres because post-punk mostly refers to the time frame of 1978 to 1984. Most of the newer bands that came out in the mid-80s that would have been labeled as post-punk were now underneath the alternative umbrella until the early 2000s with the post-punk revival. Post-punk is important because without post-punk, the entire landscape of modern alternative and pop culture would likely be unrecognizable. It was the critical link that turned punk's raw energy into the intellectualized music and independent infrastructure we see today.
But love